Good afternoon, everyone. Hi. I invite you to switch on your camera if it's possible for you. Thank you for joining us for our dialogue named Concurrent Crises as the catalyst of change, how the coronavirus pandemic can help building peace with the planet. This event is part of Sustainability Geneva, a week-long series of events organized by the Environmental Committee and UNIGE, aimed at promoting sustainability awareness and action. My name is Hugo. I'm the member of the Environmental Committee, and I'm here with Alex.
Hello, everyone. My name is Alexandre Maza, and I study at the Graduate Institute. I'm part of the Professional Development Committee, but still very much passionate about the environment. And today I'll be, like you, tuning into this dialogue and helping Hugo out here with a few of the question taking and all that kind of stuff. So I'm going to pop something into the chat right now, which I'd like to ask you to use whenever you want to ask a question, raise a point, and yeah, really looking forward to this.
Today we are very, very pleased to virtually meet Josep Garí, political ecologist and UNDP senior policy advisor in the cluster Nature, Climate and Energy. Welcome, Josep, and thank you for being here.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure.
Thank you so much. To briefly give the background of this event, 4 months ago, Josep and I jointly decided to organize an event about today's multiple crises. And the main purpose was to make the United Nations more approachable, more accessible for citizens and students. So this event is not a conference, it's a dialogue. It's a dialogue between Josep and you, meaning that we want to hear your comments, your doubts, and also your questions. The goal is really to have an interaction between all of us. Regarding the structure of the meeting, we will split the 1.5 hour discussion into 3 different sections. The first section will be about before COVID-19. Where are we coming from? The second section will be during COVID-19. Right now, where are we? What are we doing? And then the third section will be after COVID-19. Where are we heading to? So each session will be posed by introductory remarks from Josep and will be followed by a Q&A. So 3 introductory remarks and 3 Q&A, one after another. One time, the goal is to have an interaction. You don't need to have a specific question to ask for the floor. You can just have a comment, a doubt, or a personal story that maybe contradicts what Josep just said. You can speak in English, Spanish, or French. It's up to you. I think Josep can speak every language. And one more thing, to ask for the floor. So there is an emoticon button at the bottom, you can see. And the emoticon, you can see the button raise your hand. So this is the way you can try to interact with Josep, and then we will give you the floor. We strongly encourage you to address orally your questions. If you cannot speak or switch on your camera, you can write your question in the chat and Alex can read them for you. So yeah, one more time, I really invite you, if you can try to switch on your camera. It's really better for us to have an interaction, dialogue, because as we know, like speaking to black screen and square is not that fun. And we really want to have like emotion and try to really have a conversation. We know it's difficult right now, but let's try at least. Josep, do you want to add anything about the structure?
No, that's very clear, and looking forward that interaction. I would like to emphasize what you say, that the idea is to have a conversation, to have comments, questions, contributions. We are in very special, confusing times. Nobody has solutions, and the solutions actually will come through social interaction, through collective thinking, through critical mass of thinking. So the participants here, the youth, the students, everybody has something to say, and all together we'll figure out how we shape the world that is now a little bit in turbulent times. So also for me, from the UN, looking forward, your thoughts, your experiences, your ideas, we need that in the UN. So we are not just holders of solutions. We are a space for giving voices, listening the voices that very often are not heard, so humanity can craft solutions to the global problems we face. So I welcome this initiative from Hugo, from Alexander, from the colleagues of the Graduate Institute and other organizations in Switzerland for organizing an event in this spirit. We need to talk, we need to change, we need to discuss. The times now require so. Thanks.
Thank you. I think it's very clear, and we appreciate the person who switched on the camera. Thank you. Last tale, we are recording the meeting, and we will upload it on our YouTube channel. All right, so let's kick off the conversation with the first section. So, where are we coming from before COVID-19? We know that the World War II period and the creation of the United States had marked the 20th century as a century to spread peace around the world. But to what extent does the 21st century and what we usually call the Anthropocene can be considered as the century to build peace with the planet? And I use planet with a capital P. Maybe you can also explain to us why we should use a capital P for planet. So what is the policy framework that should allow us to meet our needs without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs?
Good. Thanks a lot, Hugo, for the introduction. I'll provide some comments and some reflections that can fit questions and comments and further reflections. I think it's very interesting to understand where we are actually when this global pandemic, which is not just a global pandemic, but is a crisis, came. We were in a global situation, as you all know, in which we had very important global problems that require global action, but most nations and most societies were very much turned inwards. In the last 10 years, and partly that has been triggered by the 2018 financial crisis, a lot of nations have actually closed to themselves. We have always talked about populism. This has been a mainstream trend. Every nation, every society, every group claiming that the priorities themselves. That has been a very perverse but very dominant thinking and doctrine in the world. I don't think I need to put concrete examples. You all know the examples. We have all been trapped in this kind of conversations. And I don't think it's an easy question of rejecting that. Those populists and those trends came because societies were left disoriented, and therefore easy doctrines take advantage of that. So we have been in this century, a century which opened up with a lot of hopes and expectations, with major global problems that were not addressed. In the last 10, 15 years, the international system, the international cooperation has been undermined in different ways. In part because of an excess trust in the economy, in capitalism, in the companies, maybe because everybody was trying to thrive in their own space. There has been a sort of abandon of the international relations, of the international fabric. At the times when we were facing a major global crisis, the crisis of sustainability. So in the last 15, 20 years, the international community at least have been trying to work on that. And we have done major breakthroughs in terms of international diplomacy and policy frameworks on that. They were maybe not permeating down to societies, but they were there. And they are going to be very useful instruments for the future. The two major or landmark international agreements that are structuring this century are the Paris Agreement and the Sustainable Development Goals Agenda. These are two major international undertakings, very important. The international community adopted them massively. They didn't implement them with the same passion, but on the paper, in terms of international diplomacy, they were very strong undertakings. Especially the Paris Agreement, it's a very interesting international treaty. I could say that it's possibly the most important treaty of this century, at least so far, but very likely it's going to be the treaty that structures the century. The Paris Agreement is very interesting because it's a treaty that allows nations to put sustainability in the center of their economies and their societies. It's also a treaty that, unlike other international development agreements, is not anymore talking about North and South, developed and underdeveloped or in development. These concepts are now old-fashioned. Of course, there are countries that have major development challenges and they should be recipients of major international aid. Of course, I mean, questions of international justice remains, but in the past, international cooperation was about a number of countries that were meant to be more technically developed, more politically developed, more financially wealthy to support other countries that were in that path. Nowadays, from a climate change perspective, from a sustainability perspective, every single country is very underdeveloped. And therefore, the Paris Agreement basically allows all countries to recognize that there are major challenges, and climate change is the focus of the Paris Agreement, but you can take the climate problem as a sort of proxy of the environmental crisis, of the war with the planet that humanity seems to have. Therefore, climate change is only one, a very important, possibly the major of the environmental crisis of this war on nature in which we are indulging ourselves for about a century. But there are other problems, as you know, pollution of water. There are problems like biodiversity, massive deforestation, pollution at all scales, urban, in the lands, etc. But climate change is probably the most complicated and pervasive of the environmental problems. So dealing with climate change will necessarily require societal and economic transformations of such a scale that will necessarily have and force and help to deal with the other environmental crises. So this is why climate change is so important, not only for the importance of climate change per se, but also because climate change signals the dysfunctions in societies and economies. So the Paris Agreement is a very important undertaking because it puts all the nations together. It says we have a problem and we all need to cooperate. And in the Paris Agreement, there are critical concepts that I want to highlight very rapidly because those are the elements that are going to be part of the language and the tools that the different actors in the world are going to have to use in the coming decades to take the necessary transformations. One of them is carbon. The Paris Agreement consolidates carbon as a new global unit of measure. As I said, it's not that carbon is the only problem. We have many other problems. But in terms of the environmental crisis, carbon is a very powerful, let's say, proxy or indicator or element for transformations. So the Paris Agreement consolidates carbon as a new global unit of measure. Up to now, as you know, the global unit of measure is the US dollar. That's how the world works. So if you want to have international relations, partnerships, treaties, cooperation, economy relationships, you are using the dollar as a sort of the unit by which you measure what you're doing and how you interact. Nowadays, the carbon concept, it's adding to that. Of course, the dollar is going to be prevalent and it's going to be a critical unit of measure. So there is no substitution, but we are having a new unit of measure, which is carbon. And this is why it's so important, the concepts of carbon neutrality, that now almost every country, every company is thinking about. Carbon neutrality, meaning removing carbon from your societal production, commerce, economic systems. And the objective in the Paris Agreement is for nations to try to reach carbon neutrality in 2050. This is not to avoid climate change. As you know, climate change will happen. It's happening already and will continue to happen. It's to avoid that by the end of the century, the climate change scale is not of such a magnitude that we are completely lost in coping with it. We should not forget that our societies are based on a relatively stable planet. All of our economic, agricultural systems, our planning, our seasons, our cultures, everything is based on something that we gave as assumed, which was that there were seasons, there were processes. Yes, sometimes there could be more floods or heat waves, but there was predictability. Climate change is not only an increase of a few degrees of temperature, it's actually a complete disorder of the climate, which means that we cannot actually predict what is happening. And for societies, if you cannot predict, it's very difficult to plan, it's very difficult to organize ourselves as societies. If we were all, as in the prehistorical times, small human groups, semi-nomadic, maybe we could cope better. But we are soon, in a few decades, reaching 10 billion people in the planet. We live in major cities. We want good comfort. We want to have wealth systems. We want to predict. We want to have peace. We want to plan our societies because we are many. We live together. We need to plan. We need to organize ourselves. And this requires being able to understand the environment in which we live. This environment is not anymore easy to predict. And the more climate changes, the most difficult it will be to predict. So this is why it's important to reduce the scale and the trend of climate change as soon as possible. So carbon is helping in that, and the idea, the aim is for nations to get to climate neutrality by the mid of the century. There are a number of countries from Ethiopia to the European Union that have committed to that. Even China has committed. Many companies are committing to these objectives. And they are putting it public, and everybody's going to follow that. And the companies will have to respond to their commitments. Now the US with the new administration is precisely rapidly looking at what are they going to be their commitments to reach this carbon neutrality. So this is a language that now is settling, is being agreed, and is basically about carbon, a new unit of measure. The fact that countries commit to carbon neutrality doesn't mean that they are going to reach. So we have tremendous work to do to implement policies, to change behavior, to do things differently, economy, society behavior, and also to follow and to monitor what companies and governments say and commit to do. Also to deploy the instruments, and we will talk that in the last session, what are the instruments that will help that. But this is the first important element. Carbon as a new unit of measure. Second element is that every nation is committed by this problem. This is a genuine global problem. Everybody has to take action. Here is a concept which are the national commitments for climate change, which in the UN jargon, as you know, in the UN, we like to put an acronym and jargon to everything. It's called the NDCs, Nationally Determined Contributions, a little cumbersome concept. But basically are the policy commitments that every nation have to put on paper and have to report every 5 years. And every 5 years, they have to renew these policy commitments. And those policy commitments needs to be more ambitious. So there is a sort of scaling up. Every country has to do that. We are now rapidly helping several countries, or every country that decides to make a new commitment. So what is going to happen is that in the Glasgow Climate Summit later in this year, there's going to be a first stock taking, what countries are committing. So when countries commit, they write it, they adopt it in government, and they submit to the Secretariat of the Convention of Climate Change. So this is the policy infrastructure that the Paris Agreement has set up. Apart from that, the Paris Agreement established a number of mechanisms for technical cooperation, for financial cooperation, and for knowledge exchange, so nations can bring the best knowledge and innovations to help each other on those domains. Maybe a final thing to say on the Paris Agreement and how important is that the Paris Agreement is not an instrument as in the past. Typically, UN agreements would have a number of, let's say, control mechanism and punitive measures. So if you don't respect the agreement, you would have some arbitration tribunals that will look at your case, and you could have some penalties. The way, for instance, like the World Trade Organization operates. Some people criticize that the Paris Agreement has not this mechanism, but in the end, that was not feasible. It was not possible to get almost 190 countries signing on such an accord with those mechanisms. And nevertheless, in the 21st century, we need a new kind of diplomacy. We don't need the kind of diplomacy typically that we have in the 20th century, and Hugo mentioned the case of the Second World War, how there was the UN was established, human rights treaties, international peace and security treaties, and then the Security Council as a place where this would be controlled, this would be enforced with sanctions, etc. 21st century is going to be different. 21st century is a time of dialogue, of partnerships, going beyond intergovernmental relationships. Companies have to be part of the equation. Civil society organizations have to be part of the equation. We need a new global governance. It's not a matter of imposing one to another or using military power to change. We have global problems of sustainability. We have a treaty. Every country needs to do their policy commitments. International committee sets up new instruments, and I will talk about the financial instruments in the last session. We have the instruments. Now it's a matter of honoring that and using all the mechanisms we have to try to bring these changes into place. So this is what was being built in the last 5, 10, 15 years. And then COVID hit us and confused us. This agenda was not moving very well. As you know, the US, a major country in global geopolitics, had abandoned the Paris Agreement a few years ago, and actually it was effective a few months ago. So we were all a little bit disoriented, and then this virus came to disorient us even more. So I'll stop here so we can talk about this infrastructure, this diplomatic and policy infrastructure that the international community has been building in these past years. And this is the trend and the trajectory we were having and building when COVID hit. And I'll stop here, Hugo, if you agree.
Thank you. Okay. So yeah, if I understood well, the Paris Agreement, the next conference in Glasgow, or more globally, like the international policy framework to tackle this environmental crisis, is becoming more and more accepted, but still very imperfect. And in a way, its potential to impact national priorities is unquestionable, but in practice, and mostly with COVID-19, but I mean, things may happen differently and than expected, but we will deal with that in the second section. Right now, I would like to maybe give the floor to the participants, and one more time, yeah, it's a common dialogue, so be critical and express your thought on that. Alex, do we have any ends for until now? Do you have any comment, any idea, any suggestions? Don't be shy. I mean, otherwise I will maybe go first. I would like maybe to come back on the Paris Agreement. We all remember this singular moment in 2015 when the chair Laurent Fabius banged his gavel down on the table to officialize the agreement. However, despite this COP and the numerous other COPs since Kyoto in 1995, the emissions of greenhouse gases have been increasing almost systematically. And many scholars used to compare the Paris Agreement to a picnic, actually, a picnic, yeah. And I mean, this agreement is what we usually call the bottom-up process. So as you mentioned, like each country individually and independently would pledge on some action to address the issue of climate change. And member states did not approve a plan of action, but instead each country committed itself to something which they do. And you mentioned the NDCs. in this sense, I think the Paris Agreement is like a picnic, you know, when each participant has been told to bring something to eat, and there has been no pre-established assignment. So I mean, Josep, you bring the vegetables, Alex, he brings the fish, and of course I will bring the wine. And but each one has been left to decide what they can bring. And it seemed that at the end of the day, there has been not enough food considering the expectation. The pledges do not allow to meet the target of containing global warming within 2 degrees centigrade maximum. So my question is like, or maybe the comment is like, do you realistically think that we will achieve significant decarbonization and most of all the 2-degree target?
Thanks, Hugo. And I saw also there was a question from Zaninka in Kigali, in Rwanda, on the challenge of consumerists and capitalists. So I will respond also to that. But starting with your point that is true that there is an imperfection in the Paris Agreement, but the Paris Agreement in the end is a framework. It's a framework that recognizes a global problem. It's a framework that puts all nations willing to address this problem. It's an instrument that provides, or a framework that provides a number of instruments and tools and directions to deal with it. The reality is that when the Paris Agreement was being negotiated and adopted, it was actually very difficult to get all nations. As I was mentioning at the beginning, this century has been characterized by a lack of appetite of global agreements. There has not been, until the Paris Agreement, there had not been any major international agreement. When I mean international agreement, I mean an agreement dealing with a major societal problem or question in which you have all geopolitical powers in since the World Trade Agreements in the 90s. So it means that for almost 20 years, we hardly had major international agreement. That was the appetite. That was the reality. So yeah, it's very imperfect. Yes, it's moving in a fine line, but this was a unique opportunity to get all nations sit down and agree collectively with all geopolitical powers, all perspectives, recognizing a problem and committing every 5 years to publish their policies and to enable the other parties to assess and judge those policies. So there is here a lot of work to do to civil society, to media, to citizens, to look at that and to pressure governments to honor this agreement. But it was difficult to get more than that. Nevertheless, yes, it could be giving a sense of a picnic, but if we look in the last 5 years, I mean, the Paris Agreement was enacted just 5 years ago, and it's actually from 2020 when the genuine implementation was meant to start, when unfortunately the COVID pandemic hit, so this disrupted a lot. But in these past few years, the Paris Agreement has helped a number of governments and companies to commit to carbon neutrality. And this is a very important achievement. When 10, 15 years ago, climate denials were rampant all across. And the private sector were basically saying, this is not our business, this is a business of government. We give society products and services, so let us give them. Now every company understands that yes, they have a key role in providing products and services to society, but they need to protect the climate because it's a critical global public good, and they need to demonstrate that. As examples, I want here to mention, for instance, the European Union is now working on a specific legislation to remove deforestation from imports, very stringent legislation. You have, just when the US decided to withdraw from the Paris Agreement, you had a coalition of the major US companies committing to honor the Paris Agreement and to take measures to deal with climate change. So it's changing mindsets, it's changing the language, it's not enough. Responding to your question, Hugo, if I think we will reach those goals, well, with the current trends, certainly not. I mean, if the pace of change is the one we have seen in the last few years, we are not going to reach that. But This is why this decade is so critical. This decade is the decade when critical changes have to happen. So to put societies, governments, and companies in a different direction. It's a critical decade in which a lot of things have to happen. And as I will mention later, the COVID crisis is not only an additional challenge to that, but might be actually an opportunity. Responding, but overall it's true. It's a framework agreement. It provides a direction. It brings people together, but it has actually created a global thinking. Now it's time of putting it in practice, which is more difficult than drafting and negotiating it actually. And this decade is going to be critical, because if countries and companies have not changed their economic system by 2030, it's impossible to reach 2050. And this is not about some technical fixes. These are major policy reforms. Just to put it simply, climate change requires two major reforms. One is an energy transition, and the other is to manage territories, land, ecosystems completely different. So every country will have a different sort of balance of these two major lines of action. Your energy transition, getting away from fossil fuels, and territorial transformation, especially for the South, to be able to continue to produce food in a way that keeps ecosystems and in a way that does not emit carbon. On the question of consumerism and capitalism, that's a very interesting question that was arriving from Kigali, because this is part of the problem, and this is at the same time the reality. Capitalism is very much consolidated in our planet, for good or for bad. We might disagree. When I was slightly younger, still there was a bit of discussion if we could change the system. Nowadays, capitalists, the banking sector, finance, companies are more powerful than the majority of governments. That's the reality. That's the world we have been building all together in a way, by letting companies proliferate and hold enormous power. At the same time, they have provided society with a lot of products and services we all have benefit. So it's a kind of dilemma and very paradoxical situation. But capitalism is to a big extent very entrenched in our societies and in our relationships. So the point of the Paris Agreement is how we transform our economic systems so they bring social and environmental goods, rather than using society as an externality and environment as an externality, meaning that providing people any kind of labor, polluting the environment, they have to internalize. And here is where consumption comes in. We have one of the key sustainable development goals, which is about sustainable production and consumption and trade. Indeed, as societies, we need to transition towards more austerity to dematerialize ourselves. But of course, there is a minimum need of materials that societies need. And it's very easy from the north, where we all have TVs, computers, means of travel, etc., to say that now there has to be a freeze in the planet. That's good from a moral point of view. So the point is how we transform our production and trade and consume systems to make them sustainable, make them compatible with the climate, make them carbon neutral. That's the kind of challenges. So it's a very important
I think we lost Josep. It just froze. Yeah. Let's see if it's coming back. We don't have the chance to have a second panelist to say, okay, let's let's do a round table. So unfortunately, we only have one speaker. So let's see if he can come back soon. I think Hamza, you have a question maybe? No, okay. So we have plenty of questions in the comments. So let's see when Josep will be back, and we can try to catch up.
Development goals and the Paris Agreement to address climate change.
Josep,
yes,
we lost you during I think more than a minute, maybe 2 minutes.
Oh, sorry.
No,
so sorry for that. I hope you hear me well now.
Now
I
it's
was okay. I was trying to respond. I don't know if anybody was talking, but I was trying to respond to a question from Sabri on how environmental destruction has been addressed before COVID. Was it here that I was lost?
Yeah, just before we didn't hear you like reading the question.
Okay, so I was trying to respond to that question that was from Sabri, and what I was basically mentioning that for environmental destruction, how the has been addressed in the level of the international community, there are three major conventions that were adopted in the 1992 Rio Summit: a convention for climate change, a convention for biodiversity, and a convention for land degradation. Then there is a satellite of minor conventions and agreements that deal also with specific environmental destruction problems, as Sabri is asking. And then in this century, in 2015, we have these two major landmark agreements: the Sustainable Development, the 17 and the Paris Agreement, focusing on climate change to address environmental destruction. What is different from the Rio Conventions in 1992 to the agreements in 2015 is that in 1992, the focus was on nature, on environment, a kind of an external cosmos from society. So it was just to conserve a nature that is outside from society. And they were more or less effective, but we all realized that, in fact, nature is not something external to humanity. We are part of nature, and we'll talk now on COVID. COVID has told us that we are part of nature. So the 2015 agreements, the Paris Agreement and the Sustainable Development Agenda, actually what they do is to merge nature and society. And this is why it's not just safeguarding the planet per se, it's also changing our societies and our economies to make compatible with the planet. Here comes the concept: building peace with the planet. Societies, we need to build peace with the planet. And the 2015 agreements are much more updated to allow to do that, to also not just ring fence nature, but transform our societies and our economies so they can live together with the planet, and we can have a sort of stability and predictability, which is also in the interest of humanity. I'm looking at questions, but I let Alexander and Hugo decide what are the questions that you think are much more relevant, because there are many coming.
Yeah, there are a ton of questions that are coming in, and we're moving towards the time. We're actually past the time where we move on to section 2. So maybe something that pops up as a comment and not necessarily a question is from Anna, who quoted, let that fact sink in. We now have been talking about an international agreement for a quarter of a century. We have no agreement. There's none in sight. One has to wonder if all the hot air that has been generated by all this talk was worth the carbon cost of all our globe-trotting to these COPs, which is quite hard-hitting given that these are, consistently happening conferences and with no end in sight. Although this is kind of a pessimistic view and we really hope that we can solve these things, it really kind of challenges us. But perhaps, Joseph, if you'd be so happy as to answer some of these questions after the event, if you have the time, because we'd have to move on to section 2 now, which Hugo will introduce. Thanks.
Yes, I can see that Jason had a question, Natalie as well. So if you have more minutes at the end of the meeting, we can take the time to take time to respond to this question. So yeah, let's move on. Let's move on to the section 2. Where are we now? What are we doing during COVID-19? And 2020 is unfortunately a revolutionary year in this century. 3 concurrent crises, a pandemic, a socio-economic disorder, and an accelerating climate change. They urge our societies to start considering and deploying radical solutions to address them. The COVID-19 crisis has aggravated social inequalities and marginalization in a capitalist system which created and continue to create new inequalities. Today, there are no clear alternatives, and we can notice that new movements such as La Via Campesina or some other local movement, and I'm thinking about the collapsology theory. But COVID-19 is not just a pandemic, it's a profound socioeconomic impact. It's a catharsis for societal changes. And the thinker Naomi Klein, she created the conceptual approach of the shock doctrine to underline the risk and opportunities to implement drastic changes after a crisis. For example, she demonstrated that a free market took advantage of violence, shocks, or losses of bearings of a population to conquer the world. Today, with regard to COVID era, what my question and what I think we want to know is what are the risks and the opportunities? Where should we invest, and where should UNDP, the EU, or more globally, low and middle income countries should invest during this pandemic?
Okay, I'll try to provide a few reflections on that, right? So we are in a very interesting situation. I mean, COVID, of course, has disrupted societies. It's a major disruptor. I mean, I don't need to provide example. Everybody has, from personal to their own societies, to their own university, company, job, human relationships. It's a big disruptor. But I think COVID has been a very opportune wake-up call for humanity. COVID has shown that this relation between humanity and nature, understood nature as something external that has been a problematic philosophical problem, is creating problems. We are part of nature, and we see how a virus, something that we cannot even see it, can disrupt our societies. It has shown us that we are vulnerable and that we are part of a bigger thing, which is this planet. In fact, what has happened in the last decades is that at the same time, humanity is transforming the planet. This is why the concept of Anthropocene is emerging as a new geological era in which humanity, we are changing the planet, but at the same time, we are very vulnerable to the planet. So the changes we inflict to the planet are hitting back. You know, all the natural problems that are being aggravating and accelerating, and of course, COVID. That reminds us that when we disrupt nature, we are much more vulnerable and prone to get pathogens getting into society. It has also reminded us that we are global. We're a global society. I mean, with a lot of fragmentations and spaces and interfaces, but we are a global society. And somehow I think that COVID is waking up a little bit the perception in humanity that we are a single community, that there are global affairs, and that there are problems that need global cooperation. That the beauty of the 20th century, when the international system was created because there are problems that humanity faces that are bigger than the tribe, than the local community, than your nation, than your job space, than your region. There are problems that are global that can only be solved globally. That's the origin of the UN. So it's not an artifact created for the sake of creating. It's because there are problems that are global and require global cooperation. And this mentality somehow was vanishing in the past 10, 15 years. Populism was the latest and the strongest wave that undermine this idea that we are a global community, that we have and we face global challenges, and we need global institutions and global cooperation. So COVID somehow woke this up. So it's a crisis that adds to two other crises. We were having the environmental crisis that I was mentioning, and we were also having a very important social crisis in the last 10 years, especially 10, 15 years. A social crisis that maybe was not that much discussed, but was there, especially in the form of social inequalities. What we have seen in the world is in the last 10, 15 years, global inequalities have been growing massively across the world, no matter which country. You had global inequalities in Rwanda, and you had global inequalities in the US, growing. Societies polarizing. That was indeed part of the breeding ground for populists and for nationalistic solutions that actually will not solve any of those problems, but predate on this frustration of society. You have had a lot of social movements that try to reflect that there is a social uneasiness. So when COVID arrives, it's an additional crisis. It disrupts societies, it disrupts human relationships, it disrupts public health, it disrupts economies. But finally, this conjunction of crises, it's starting to tell every society, every dialogue, every citizen, every social actor, hey, we need to think differently. We need to deal with things differently. We need to look at systemic changes. So there are changes underway, and COVID has been and is being a catalyzer. The first I want to mention is the efforts that rapidly from the UN we started to craft after the COVID hit, which was under the concept of building back better, of building what I prefer more to say building in a much more greener and inclusive way. So it was finally that there has to be a response to all these crises that put society and the environment at the center. So what in the UN and in particular in UNDP, the kind of offer I'm thinking is that when countries are going to have to reconstruct themselves in the face of all these disruptions, because there is now no any more margin to keep on living with disruptions, the kind of problems and tension and disaffection of societies are so big that there has to be a new restructuring. And we think that there are three major lines of work globally. Then every country is going to have to decline in their own circumstances. One is that we need a new social contract. This is very important to feel. There has been discussion on this need of a new social contract. There needs to be a recognition of how important public governance is. And we see in the pandemic, if governments and public governance and public health are not well managed, we all suffer. So there is a new rethinking and a new feeling in society that the institution of collective governance are crucial. We need to invest in them. We need to have the best professionals governing our societies. We need to devote time from the community associations to the trade unions, to the media, to have the right conversations and to build the best ideas to have better governance. And also a social contract that will have to do with inequalities. I just want to put one example of this change of mindset, the concept of basic social income. 10 years ago, when we would talk about and proposing basic social income, everybody or many people or many economies and powerful actors would say, well, this is a dream, but this is unrealistic, cannot work. Now, basic social income is a topic on the table of many economists, many political parties, many think tanks. There are discussions underway. So it's a new social contract that we are all going to have to do at national level, at global level, different levels, but has to deal with this public governance and this inequality and this sort of rebuilding the social tissue. And this is very important because, as one of the commenters was mentioning, the predominance of capitalists made us forget that capitalism doesn't play in a void. It plays in a social contract in which societies, we agree and we decide democratically how we want to live, what are our priorities, how we use public funding, how we drive the private sector, what are our goods and services that we want to give priority, what are the changes we want to enact. So this is getting a new role. The second building block is about the green economy. So the economies has been disrupted, so they have to be rebuilt to some extent. And here is where it comes, what I was mentioning in the first section, the importance of using the green thinking to embed economies. So economies is not building back better, is not reconstructing the capitalist system, is to building a new economy, a green economy, an inclusive economy too. So that's a second important pillar. And the third one is the digital transition. We were all living in this digital world. We were all in social media using computers since 10, 15 years ago. But it was a kind of something that was there that we were using. It's now structuring our societies. Thanks to digital, the digital revolution, we have been able to cope with COVID. Imagine how the COVID pandemic would have been without Zoom, without video conference, without home delivery, with all these kind of connections. We would have been much more disrupted, and probably we would be in major social chaos. The digital revolution has been critical, and it's going to be more critical in the decades to come. There are elements, one I saw in the chat, somebody mentioning how digital relationships and the digital platforms allow us to reduce the carbon footprint. That's true. Taking one of the questions, we don't need these massive climate gatherings. Yes, for certain negotiations, we need the negotiators to be in a room, but you don't need a tree with 300 or 400 people. So you can have 8,000 people meeting through these means. So digital revolution was there, but it looked like we had not appropriated, with the good and bad things it had, with the risk of controlling, with the risk of privacy, with the risk of interference. So here is where it comes the first point of the social contract. The social contract has to come with rules on how the digital revolution has to be deployed. What are the rules? What are the basic control mechanisms? And the digital revolution brings a lot of opportunities, but brings two problems. The problem of intromission and the problem of inequality, because we could also have inequalities in terms of digital access. So it's a lot to do on that. That has been the sort of thinking that rapidly in the UN we provided to offer countries with a sort of blueprint. But then very rapidly there has been interesting changes, and I want to mention perhaps paradigmatic case, but it's a signal of where things will go. The European Union Green Deal. As you know, there was a new European Union sort of policy fabric in 2019 with a new parliament, with a new commission. And in January 2020, they unveiled what was a new pact, what was the European Union Green Deal. And just then, COVID hit 2 months later. So now all the recovery policies of the European Union will have to respond to two criteria: green recovery and digital transformation. And this is very important because we are talking about massive flows of public investments and also a directive to the private sector on how the European Union is going to be reorganized. Of course, when you put billions of dollars in certain direction, you have an impact. It's not only the amount of funding, it's the policy signal it gives. So the European Union now, in this COVID, has changed it completely, has been able to put the recovery and to put the funding volumes to the green economy and the Green Deal and to digital transformation. So these are going to be the two major lines of work that are going to structure and disrupt and reconstruct many other domains of society. So these are not the only two things that a society has to do, but these are going to be the two streams that are going to structure and readjust everything in society. Many other countries are going to follow in similar directions. And in the UN, we are already helping countries to think how they use their international cooperation funding in order to deal with the recovery that the crisis has made, including, among other reasons, the fact that I think everybody in the world agrees that public health systems are critical for society. So there is a new thinking, and it's what COVID created, a new thinking that there are global commons, there are things that pertain to everybody that requires that we protect them, we invest in them, we give them priorities. When we don't give them the priorities, as happened in the past years, we suffer more. So as society, we need a new social contract. We need, and COVID has allowed us to think, yes, let's revisit our societies profoundly. Let's put the green factor in the equation. And let's not forget that inequality was breathing up, and we need new instruments, from investing in people to basic income. Let's be bold about ideas. This is what COVID allows, all that in the middle of tremendous disruption and suffering and deaths. As usual, crises come with risk and opportunities. So we are in a critical moment in which we need to devise policies and practices to minimize the risks and to change. I'll stop here.
Thank you. Thank you. I think we can speak about social contract for hours, but I will just give the floor to Alex. I think we have some question, or maybe the question from the previous section.
Thanks, Hugo. Thanks, Joseph. So I'm actually going to go to, I think, is Jason's question, which relates a little bit to exploitation and the social contract that we need to think about in the 21st century and the environment at large. So Jason's question is, how do we deal with the fact that in order to meet many of the requirements necessary for the green revolution to tackle climate change, there are many social issues associated with it? And he specifically uses things related to electric vehicles, batteries, digital devices, etc., that require certain minerals where there's been a huge amount of documented human rights abuses and exploitation. So on a practical basis, how do we ensure that the supply chain is not only green in the contents that it trades, but also the people that are able to extract these? Thanks.
That's a very good question. The key point, and that connects to the comment we have before on capitalism, production and consumption, is how we set up those systems and how we monitor them. So the basic assumption that we had until recently was that the companies, because they provided goods and services, they had free will. They were not accountable whatsoever because they contribute to the economic fabric of society. Now the moral equation has changed. Yes, companies provide that. That's the objective, but they cannot provide it at any cost, at any sense. It means that they cannot give any salary to people. They cannot produce. And here comes a number of things, like you said, or one of the participants was mentioning that, yes, maybe you reduce carbon, but maybe you use more polluting metals. Well, here, that's why we need scientists and engineers to judge that and to provide information. So in the end, what as a society and as citizens we need, it's information. We need to know, and we should know, every product, every commodity chain, every trade arrangement, what is its social and environmental record. And now companies cannot say, that's difficult. That's why we have the digital revolution. The digital revolution allows you to make governments and companies accountable. So yes, it might make the production a bit more expensive. They need to put data, but that's why we have this. So when you are using Amazon to get a home delivery, it tells you wherever, the price, when you return. Why cannot tell you where this was produced, who participated, what components were used, what is the carbon results? And with technology, you can have independent actors assessing and commenting on that. So the same technological revolution we have can help citizens to assess all that and can help governments to track all that. So we have the means here. Then, of course, the challenge is how to put it in place, but this is possible. Now there has been a discussion in the past months, especially in Europe, on how to taxate and how to control the big transnational companies that are making a lot of business across the world, but then they are registered in a small location where they don't pay taxes. Well, we see that we can have legislation that still does not make companies unprofitable. They can, but they have to render taxes, they have to render information, they need to show changes. So this is feasible. We have the means to have this information. Then scientists will be able to provide a sort of assessment, and citizens and governments in the end are going to judge what is the trade balance. Of course, nothing is perfect. We are not going to have anything perfect, but the point is to have the information and to be able to make decisions as individuals, as citizens, as consumers, as societies. So one of the options is to require companies to use digital means to make public information of how they produce things, with civil society and scientists being able to corroborate that, to correct that, to question that, so we know that there is no cheating. So the digital revolution, yes, it's a risk because now there is all this mega data. Everybody, it might seem that they know when I go to toilet without really somebody might know, or some algorithm could know because of geographic position. Okay, there are risks that we need to control, but there are opportunities. So the sort of risk needs to be controlled by legislation, but the opportunities also, legislation need to harness that, so we all know what happened to everything that goes through our economic systems. I don't have a solution, but I'm suggesting that we have the means to be able to have the information and to be able to emit a judgment, whether in public or through our consumer choices.
Thank you. Yeah, it would be a bit pretentious to ask you directly the main solution to fix the current issue. Thanks. I think we should move on to the last section. The last section is going to be about where are we heading to after COVID-19. I strongly believe everyone in this room or in this virtual room should agree on the fact that global warming is real and it's probably the main crisis of humankind. But we can read, we can read sometimes in the newspaper the term collective good, public health. But what are going to be the new economic instruments to make to tackle this issue? What does climate finance mean? To what extent high-income countries should share the burden of such policies? Can low, middle-income countries benefit from the energetic transition? So that's my main concern for the instrument, and I give you the floor, Josep.
Thanks, Hugo. It is true that we presented in these first two sections a little bit the trend where we were coming, especially in the environmental and what the COVID crisis is impacting and disrupting. So there's a number of fronts that I outlined that societies are going to have to handle. We mentioned about the green recovery, we mentioned about sustainability, we mentioned about the digital transition, about the new social contract, about new social policies that bring more equality, that ensure that people have sufficient means of resources. So these are the big lines of work internationally. Then the details need to be figured out with the experts and the civil society organizations and the governments that have expertise and knowledge on that. So here I would like to work on one of the areas in which I work more personally, so I can provide a little bit more glimpse. That is going to be one of those new streams that are already in the making, and it's going to be part of this new post-COVID, if one could say, equation, which is climate finance. So as I mentioned, the Paris Agreement societies, public policy, and companies to new ways of operating, where carbon is a new unit of measure. So this goes associated with changing economic instruments and mobilizing finance in a different way. And this is why we define as climate finance as a little bit more generic concept. And within climate finance, you have carbon finance, which is finance that is more related to carbon measurements. So climate finance is a very important funding flows that is in the making, it's emerging, it's consolidating, and is meant to be major in the future. So I was mentioning one of the examples, the case of the European Union, how the Green Deal and how its alignment with the COVID recovery funding has to be related to climate. That's a very important element. Another element, for instance, the European Union have enacted by law that the international cooperation of the European Union with the countries in the South should be devoted at least 30% of funds to climate objectives. That's enormous. And these are the new legislations on the paper enacted official. So when the European Union sits down in the table with another country for international cooperation, at least 1/3 of the finance have to be for climate change. Just for you to know that when the European Union cooperates with any country, there are a lot of sectors that are on the paper: rural infrastructure, energy, education, health, water, you name it. 1/3 is just has to be clearly having climate impact. So this is changing, and this is part of this climate finance thinking. The Paris Agreement also has objectives that in theory towards 2020, but we are a little bit delayed, but probably around 2025, the international finance for climate should be in the order of magnitude of $100 million. And this order of magnitude is more or less equivalent to the international development cooperation funding, which is more or less around $130, $140 million, has been stable for the last 10, 15 years. So what we are talking is that climate finance, according to the Paris Agreement, has to be almost of the same scale as the international development cooperation finance that we have been having for the last 10, 15 years. And it cannot substitute it, has to be additional. So that shows how international relations, how international financial flows are going to change. There is another element. As you know, the Green Climate Fund was enacted a few years ago precisely to facilitate finance. And you have now, with carbon as the new unit of measure and with carbon finance, the emergence of carbon markets with all the opportunities risks brings. Carbon markets are meant to be precisely instruments that allow countries and companies to consolidate their climate change objectives. So of course, there is the risk of greenwashing. There is the risk of using these instruments to pretend you are green, but you are not doing. But in fact, the carbon markets that are still being fixed and negotiated, and in the Glasgow Climate Summit in November, there are going to be critical negotiations to close the rules for that. Carbon markets is a critical element of Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. And this is a new area of work. It's a lot of funding that will flow because the philosophy of carbon markets is that the countries and the companies that are in a clear and credible path of climate neutrality, but for structural problems they cannot reach the targets in the short term, they can reward countries and companies that exceed their carbon records. So it's a process of international cooperation in order to ensure a rapid and accelerated path towards the 2050 carbon neutrality goals. This is going to be massive. You have companies like Microsoft that not only have agreed to be carbon neutral much before 2050, but they want to be carbon positive from around 2050. You have companies like Unilever, like Google, making agreements and putting significant amounts of funding for that. So carbon markets are going to be important because if they are properly regulated according to the agreements in the Climate Convention, they are going to have to be transparent, information should be public, and the carbon market should be used in order to consolidate pathways for climate neutrality, not as a mechanism to do a marketing or branding. Of course, we know that we are going to have a lot of these problems. So this is why it's important that we all discuss and that we have the best measures to monitor that. As examples, for instance, there are already a number of performance-based financial mechanisms because climate finance is meant to be a performance finance. Unlike international cooperation aid in the past, when a country wanted to do something, had a challenge, had a problem, presented a project saying, I have a public education problem, I need to build 100 schools, this is the amount of money I need. The international community will provide investments to do that, and then the results could be more successful or less successful. Climate finance is meant to be a performance finance. The money will flow when you have results. Carbon is showing these results. One of the areas that is very important is the forest. As you know, the forests are an important cause of climate change and could be a massive or the major factor of climate change in a few years if we don't change the pattern of deforestation. At the same time, we all know that conserving forests and restoring forests can be a great climate mitigation solution. So one of the things in the UN we are supporting through a concept which is called REDD+, another acronym as usual, but this is basically in Article 5 of the Paris Agreement, is to reward the countries in the South that conserve and restore their forest. And this is not just to say, I'm going to conserve my forest, it's to demonstrate it. And nowadays, we have satellite information, satellite mechanisms, independent advisory committees that do this checking. You see through satellites, for instance, Brazil is able to have a full picture of the Amazonia where there is a forest every 14 days, looking at the satellite images. So we have the means now to look at territories. So yes, you can use that to do industrial espionage or military espionage, but you can use to monitor the health of the planet and to devise measures and to allocate financial incentives. So for instance, the team in which I'm working, we have been helping countries like Brazil, Ecuador, Indonesia, Costa Rica to be recognized for results they did to reduce deforestation in past years. Because you need to use the past years to assess all the data. And with these resources, what those countries are doing, they are creating a specific financial mechanism or they use existing mechanisms to implement actions in the field. Climate finance doesn't come with a free check. There are social and environmental safeguards that are regulated in the convention, and there has to be committees in the countries that monitor that. It's a new structure that is in the making, and with the Article 6 negotiations that hopefully in the Glasgow Climate Convention will be consolidated, we're going to have new instruments, new taxes, new carbon markets in order to help this transformation, not to hide behind, in order to realize responsibilities and commitments. So this is the opportunity we have at hand. There are new instruments, there are new approaches, they have risks, there are safeguards measures, and it's up to society to build them in the way that they are going more effective for the planet, more inclusive for society, and genuinely changing how public policy and private policy, which is business, become more sustainable. And I'll stop here.
Thank you so much. Many thanks, Josep. Alex, do we have any comments to date for? No, we don't. Maybe we can wait a few seconds if you have any comments that ID about.
I see one question on carbon markets and the role of the private sector. And I was mentioning that a little bit, but maybe to comment on that more is that we all know that companies have been one of the major factors of environmental crisis and the social inequalities. So for these reasons, they have to be primary solution to that. They have to commit, there have to be legislation that forces them the transformation. So carbon market is precisely an instrument that allows the private sector to enact those transformations. So it's not simply to do because they are obliged, but because they are going to have instruments to do so. But of course, carbon markets needs to go with other things. Like, for instance, there has to be a change in the fiscal measures that are supporting fossil fuels. Nowadays, the international incentive means for fossil fuels are much bigger than all climate finance. With this equation, we are not going to have the transformations of the scale. So at the same time as new instruments like green bonds, like carbon markets, like new taxes, a carbon tax for the air companies with the CORSIA mechanism that has been created, this will help change. There has to be also a massive disincentivization of fuel taxes. And that's not easy. You can see how in France, when 2 years ago, before the COVID, the government wanted to enact a carbon tax, there was a major social mobilization, actually by the poorest of the people who say, we want to see new policies for the climate to be equal. We don't want to have the burden of the change. Everybody has to be the burden. And those with more powers, the costs have to be more important part of the solution. And this is why all these instruments are crucial to ensure that the private sector can enact what they are committing and can they show, and we need transparent measures to see, to track, to say, to denounce, and to reward when there is a positive behavior.
Thank you, Josep. And we have a question from Natalie, as well as Camille. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, but the first question is natural capital proven to be an effective tool to assist natural resource management and sustainable development for the private sector? And then the second question is, do you think circular economy is a promising solution, and should it be taken into account by companies?
Yeah, I think in both responses, I would say yes. And these are part of this sort of package of many solutions that we all need to put it in place, or all actors need to put it in place. The concept of natural capital is very interesting, because one of the problems of capitalism has been that the economic mindset has been just looking at financial assets as the only unit of measure. So the concept of natural capital, by using the term capital, which is something that companies and economic actors understand better, it's a good effort to address one of the big externalities, which has been nature. The crisis we have with the planet is because nature has been an externality of our socio-economic systems. So the concept of natural capital and all the measurements, evaluation systems, tools, approaches about natural capital will help with this bridging, will help to reduce those externalities. So I think that is an effective tool, but it's not going to solve every problem, because there has to be also new ways of producing and trading and monitoring things. But I think this is important, and that not only the private sector, but also the public sector. Also, the national budgets need to look at what is their ecological footprint. So it's all budgets, so whether it's government or companies, and whether it's also our household economy. We need to look at our economy in the house. What is our impact? And we need to correct, and maybe we need to compensate. So it has to go through all the sectors. That's what is the beauty of the Paris Agreement, that yes, it's an international agreement, so it's signed by governments. Everyone can apply. Your municipality can apply the Paris Agreement. You can apply in your household economy. You can apply in your association, in the university, in the trade union. Every social actor can apply it, and can devise measures, can do monitoring. You can also do your carbon footprint. There are plenty of websites that tells you where you live, how is your house, and gives you an approximately accounting of that. So yes, we all need to put natural capital on the question. On circular economy, yes, circular economy is critical. We need to rethink about the material flows. The economy is always going to have some inputs and some outputs at some point, but the more we can make it circular, I think this is critical. The more economy can be localized, it's better, but at the same time, sometimes international relations or international trade is important, because there are goods and services that are needed elsewhere, because we are connected, and because also trade has been demonstrated and a big factor of wealth and development of nations. So we need to find the right balances. We need to have the key questions, we need to have the right monitoring, and we need to make as societies the right decisions. So the point is not to have prescriptive solutions, it's to have honest solutions. So it's not about I'm going to do this on this. Everybody individually, collectively, associatively, nationwide will adopt a number of measures. What is important is that we ask what is the ultimate impact and what are the changes, because what is important and the Paris Agreement tells is that we need a change. You are not going to do overnight. We are not going to do overnight. We need to be in a virtuous trajectory that has to be ambitious, has to be honest, and has to accelerate over time. So all these instruments like the circular economy, natural capital are instruments that allow different human and social agencies, whether it's your house or a big company, to do the changes and the reforms that are needed. I'm trying to look at the
Joseph, I think there's an earlier question from Natalie that somewhat speaks to what you're talking about, because you mentioned a lot of things around behavior changing, and that obviously requires a lot of education not only from a young age in terms of our normal, traditional educational systems, but also in a corporate setting, etc. And one question from Natalie is, what is planned in terms of communication and education to ensure that everyone who can participate and contribute to this transition? So not only individuals, but also individuals within companies and other kinds of organizations, to go beyond just a surface level understanding of the issues and where they can plug in to solve some of these challenges.
That's a very interesting question. Actually, the Paris Agreement deals about that. I was now looking exactly what was the article. I think it's around articles 20 and 29. I think that they talk about the importance of education, knowledge, communications in the behavioral changes that we information important and training. Because it's about bringing a mindset. In the end, what you educate, the information you put in society is kind of fuel for the society. The key question you have on the table is what drives. So if we are discussing about COVID, this takes central stage. If we talk about sustainable development, this takes central stage. So information and communication are very important. And the only I can say here, or not the only, but a couple of things I might want to say. One thing is information. We have suffered in the last 5-6 years a major lack of trust in the scientific community, in public information. We have all the key word, the fake news sort of dynamic. Also the fact that social media, yes, allows to reach out each other very rapidly, but has not the depth, has not the quality. We are shifting trust as a society to base on opinion and judgment. And don't get me wrong, we need opinion, we need different ideas, we need to contrast ideas, we need debate. But if we don't have basic and reliable information that can help us to find clarity, because the objective of public discussion is not to win the discussion, is to get collective clarity on what are the problems and how we can move forward. That's the objective. This basic, let's say, illustration mindset that was nurtured 200-300 years ago in a social movement through the French Revolution somehow, this has been lost. There's a lot of opinion, very shallow one, but there is a lack of trust on a critical piece for opinion and democracy to operate, which is information. With a specific corpus of society, it's very good in providing the academia. These are the pieces of society that we finance and we recognize to provide information for society to think and discuss. Scientists don't say and should not say how society should live, should provide information so society can discuss, have collective clarity, and governments can put the right policies to make that into action. And what happens is that you have governments giving whatever opinion, society completely lost or overexcited over social media, and we are all confused. So it's so important to drive these changes that we have, and we use information and communication in the way they are designed and they are meant. And we have lost that. So there is tremendous work to do. That's one of the areas that is important to build up. As you know, there is, for instance, in the food and agricultural domain, an important movement that was created in 2024, so the slow food movement. Eating slowly, meaning looking at what you eat, appreciating, looking at the culture, at the production, at the farmer, at the social interaction. Now COVID is reminding us how important that is because we cannot enjoy a proper meal together. We need the same in all those sustainable development topics. We need to, it's not to slow down action. I mean, we need to accelerate, but you understand my point. We need to slow down the thinking. We need to be more wise, more in discussion. We are too much entering into moral debates, into positioning, into trenches, into tribal. One country is not your enemy. One company is not your enemy. Another society is not your enemy. And this is what COVID is waking up. We have global problems of major magnitude that we are only able to solve them collectively. And to find the solutions collectively, we need information, we need to communicate. It requires devoted to that proper discussion mechanism. This is part of the democratic renewal and the new social contract. And here is what I think is so important, the university, and it's so important, the new generation, the young people. Because you come less polluted, and if you are able to articulate in your spaces, in your training, social movements, associations that discuss, not just shaming out who is badly behaving, that is very easy to pinpoint, but to nurture spaces, we're going to discuss, we are going to bridge other countries. I want to talk to this company. So when you do, and I think you are doing in the Swiss Sustainability Week, bring the companies, have discussion. Let's have the hard talk, but not the mean talk. That's what is needed. So we need information and communication to be able to have solid basis for discussion, to see collectively, to compare news, and to build societies, which has been undermined majorly, not only by populists, but by many things. But populism has been a little bit the big fire in the last few years, where information disappeared, where communication was just shallow opinions, and where everybody's blaming everybody else. So we need to bring us together, because there is no way to solve these global problems if we are not a community of thinking, which can become a community of practice. So I fully agree, information and communication is so vital. And because the young generation is actually getting the information and also demanding what information you want, and because you are the best experts in the world in the new digital communication means, let's try to use your energy and your wisdom in order to change that dynamic. So information and communication can be tools of change rather than tools of paralyzing, or rather for doctriners of mediocre people that rule our companies and our worlds, as we have seen recently. So that will be my response, that this is so important, and it's important because it has been tremendously eroded, both information and communication.
Many thanks for your precious and personal advice. I think we greatly appreciate it. And unfortunately, it seems we have reached the end of our event today. And all the questions from the chat have been answered by you, Josep. So we are glad and the job has been done. Thank you all for the participation and your comments. Thank you, Alex, for monitoring the Q&A. We still have plenty of events coming up, and on Thursday and Friday you can explore and register for the rest of the Sustainability with Geneva events by going to the 2 links in the chat. I would like to extend a huge and sincere thank you to Josep. It's not every day that we have the chance to talk with someone from the UN who is engaging helping nations, companies, and civic organizations to channel this current crisis. Most of all, thank you for the opportunity of having an informal talk like this one. Really appreciate, and I'm confident that the attendees and participants found your words fruitful and illuminating. Do you want maybe to have any final words before we end the session, Josep?
Just to thank you and everybody for the passion, interest. It has been a pleasure. Thanks for the comments. I look at them. I'm going to copy paste so I can read it more carefully later. And if anybody has any concern, or especially any criticism of what I could have done better, or what you expected that I didn't deliver, please write in the chat, because the only way to improve is something. And I welcome that, and I think the UN, we need to be open to that, to have the discussion. So don't hesitate to send also any negative comment. But thanks a lot. Everybody has been working hard on organizing this event and the Swiss Sustainability Week for this great idea. All the best in the continuation. I might join some of the events if my time allows. So congratulations and thanks a lot.
Thank you, Zeb. Thank you so much. As I can see in the chat, yeah, Natalie just said that she was 45 and she has been convinced by young people. So thank you, Natalie, for joining us and for participating. We hope this discussion has inspired you in some way, whether that means understanding from a new perspective the multiple crises, or just like enlarging your interest in towards sustainability and in your daily life, or just as students. Thank you again for your time, and remember, we stay sustainable. Bye-bye. Thank you so much. Goodbye.